Dr. Dan Finn got his bachelor's from the St. John's Fisher College. He also got a master's and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's a professor of theology and Clemens Professor of Economics and at the liberal arts. And he has written some amazing literature, including The Moral Ecology of Markets, Assessing Claims About Markets and Justice, and Just Trading, on the Ethics and Economics of the International Trade. So we can welcome him up right now.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to see a lively group here this morning, first thing in the morning. I'm asked to talk a little bit about the common good and creation. And there's, of course, too much to talk about in a short period of time. I'm sure you've heard this from everybody so far. But I want to say a couple things about it and why it's difficult for Christians in the United States and anywhere else to talk about this, but especially in the U.S. And the first reason is that there's kind of a theological problem we have. Because environmental problems are pretty recent in world history. Right? For the first many hundreds of years of Christian history, people didn't have to worry about despoiling the planet. Right? The footprint of humanity was so small that while we might make a mess in one place, you really weren't worried about damaging the environment altogether. There are some examples of, in the 18th century, of coal smoke in London being so bad and so forth. But on the whole, it's a very recent phenomenon that the whole world is aware that we could really mess things up. And so we, in a living tradition, as we have in Christianity, in a living tradition, the people of that era are trying to ask, what does the tradition, scripture, tradition since in the past, say to what we have today? And if the environment hasn't been a big problem, you don't see a lot of writing about the environment and religion in the earlier centuries of the church because it wasn't a problem. So a lot of work is going on today, looking back to places where, in fact, one can find resources for this in the tradition, because there always has been a fundamental respect for creation. Think of the Psalms, all the earth praises the Lord, not just humans. But that's a theological problem for us today, because we don't have the long history of treatment of that the way we do, let's say, of what should we do about helping poor people. Because there have been poor people through all of history, a lot more has been said directly about that problem than about the environment. So that's one of the problems, but it's not the problem I'm going to talk to you about today. You've had other folks talk about some of those problems. The one I want to talk about is a problem that we have as Americans that I think is worse here than maybe anywhere else in the world. And that is good old American individualism. And how that works out in our conceiving of our relationship with the material world. Because, of course, that's part of the problem with the environment, right? How do we think about the material world around us? And while there hasn't been, as I say, a lot of treatment of environmental problems in our theological history, there clearly is a lot been said about the treatment of material things. And so I want to say a few things about that. Because in our political scene right now in the country, there are many people who see the relation between humans and things very differently than Christians do. Even some people who call themselves Christians who don't realize how their conceiving of the relation between themselves and things is un-Christian. And the place where this comes up most importantly for the environment has to do with what we think about ownership. Because ownership is one of the main ways we relate to things, right? We think of the things you own, right? Think of this room, think of this table, think of the grass outside. There are ownership documents someplace, right, for all of these things. Not very much of what was around us is not owned. And so it turns out that how we think about owning something is really critical for how we think about relating to things, which is really critical for how we think about relating to creation and our responsibilities toward it. So getting a little more concrete, there's a group of folks who call themselves libertarians in the United States who are politically becoming more and more important. but whose view of ownership is very individualistic and very absolute. If I own something, I own it, get your hands off of it, whether you're another person or whether you're the government or anybody, a very absolute view of ownership. And the problem this causes for our understanding of the common good and creation is that if we think that we really ought to have stricter environmental laws, let's say this coastline is very sensitive, right? We don't want buildings built on the coastline because of the damage it would do, et cetera, or the damage to the fishing industry or the coral reefs or whatever else. These people would say, no, wait a minute, if that coastline is owned by somebody, they get to decide what to put up there. If you want to put up a 5-star hotel, that's okay, because they own it. The government should have nothing to say about it. Or if the government gets involved, they must reimburse this person who owns the land. Because now the new law that says you can't build a hotel means it's worth less money. And therefore, the argument goes, the government should reimburse them for the loss of that money they might have made. This is a very individualistic view of ownership. Because in fact, another way to look at it is that we as a community have responsibility for that coastline or any other environmental problem that might arise. And we as a community need to take responsibility for that. And that's more important than ownership. But in the US of A, there aren't too many things for most people that seem more important than ownership, because we have such an absolute view of ownership. So I want to spend a little bit of time on what ownership means in the Christian tradition. So we're going to race through, I apologize, just 3,000 years of history here in the next 5 minutes. But if we look at the Hebrew scriptures on the Old Testament, what do they say about owning stuff? And it's part of the law there that if I own a field of grain, I'm a farmer, I can harvest that field. But if I happen to leave behind a sheaf of wheat, they used to do it in the old days, put these together, and leave it behind overnight because it got dark and I missed it, I'm not allowed to go back and pick it up the next day. I'm supposed to leave that there for the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien, the people who would be the poor of the day. Widows in a patriarchal society are in bad shape if their kids don't take care of them, or they don't have any living children. Orphans are always in a bad way. And of course, non-citizens are always given a hard time in many countries. So that's what's to be done. If I own a vineyard, the law says I can pick the vineyard. I go through and pick the grapes, but there's always a few that aren't quite ripe yet, right? So you leave them behind. The law says I may not go back. It's wrong to go back and take those grapes after they're ripe. I'm supposed to leave them there for the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien. Right? Now, why would that be? It's a view of ownership that says I don't have absolute control over what I own, right? Because the Lord owns the land. The land is a gift from God. And so with that gift comes obligations. Special obligations toward those who can't take care of themselves. Right? So this is the source of a long tradition that runs all the way through Christianity. That says when it comes to owning things, ownership is never absolute. We have obligations that go along with that ownership. So if we look to the early church, some of the early church fathers said some really strong things about ownership. St. Ambrose, the great Archbishop of Milan, said, when you give to the poor person, do not think you're giving out of your charity. You are giving back what you owe him. Holy cow. Right? Holy cow. This is money that you earned, and you're not going to give it to somebody. And it's not a gift, it's what you owe him. This is very strong language. This is long before Karl Marx, long before socialism and communism. This is fundamental Christian doctrine. Why? Because the general rule in the early church was if I have more than I need, and you have less than you need, I should share with you from my surplus. And why? Because what I have is a gift of God. And the material world is to meet everyone's needs. That's the purpose of it, from the point of view of this history. The material world is to meet everybody's needs. And so I shouldn't stand in the way of that. Right? It's wrong for me to stand in the way of that. Therefore, I have an obligation to share with you. Now, there's an awful lot that happens in the meantime. But we look even at the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and John Calvin, for all of their disagreements with the Vatican over lots of other doctrines. When it comes to this issue, they are on the exact same page. exact same page on what ownership means. There's no split between Protestants and Catholics on this topic. Think of contemporary popes in the last 50 years. Same kind of teaching. Think St. John Paul II. His teaching was that this is the most fundamental doctrine for understanding our social responsibilities. This sense that the material world is given to humanity to meet the needs of everybody. And therefore, whatever private property laws there are, and they're not a bad idea, but they have to be limited by this ultimate obligation we have to share, to look out for the common good. He applies this to the issue of employment. And I'll just say a word about that, even though we're going to talk more about environment here. But we know that for most of the history of the world, most people were farmers, right? And so the teaching of the Bible was about a farm culture. And so we need to have people be able to take care of themselves. You may have heard of the Jubilee year in the Old Testament. Every 49 years, there was a Jubilee year in which land was supposed to be given back to anybody, family, who had sold it in the meantime in the last 49 years. Supposed to be given back. And the reason, of course, is that people should ideally be able to support themselves. And in an agricultural economy, you can't do that without land, right? You got to have some kind of access to land. And so that was really important. But what John Paul realized, and his predecessors had for the last 130 years, realized, is that in the modern world, we're not farmers, right? Very few of us are farmers. About 1% of all Americans are farmers. It used to be 70 or 80% were farmers. So what people need today are jobs, right? And so the ordinary way that the material world meets people's needs today is by getting a job, getting a wage, and taking that wage money to the grocery store where you buy what you need. Right? That's how we do it. And so John Paul argued that this responsibility of ownership now applies to jobs. And so he talks about the right to employment. We could say a lot more about this. But there is this sense that because of our Christian view of what ownership means, people that own businesses have certain responsibilities. Now, not to hire anybody that comes in the door, but that there is a responsibility that we can talk about if you like. But turning to the environment, John Paul does this, and well as Pope Benedict and Pope Francis today, ask what does all this mean about the environment, right? So if what we own is not absolute, then we have a fundamental obligation to respect the integrity of creation. Right? And it comes out of this understanding of ownership, this understanding of how we as Christians relate to the material world. Right? It's different from this absolute ownership kind of argument. Even though that absolute ownership argument is quite powerful. And maybe you can see it in your own life with your own things. I sometimes talk to my students about, suggest to them, you own a textbook. Let's say you bought a textbook. And maybe it was in a course you didn't like very much. We all have some of those, the toughest sort of subjects for us. And when the course is over, let's say it's done in the fall, I talk to people about chemistry was my example of the courses that I never quite related to very well in college. I asked them, when you go home at Christmas, if you really wanted to, could you just take that textbook home and take it to the fireplace and one page at a time, put that baby in the fire because that's the last chemistry course I'm ever going to take. And of course, this Christian Jew would say, no. If there's anybody out there who needs that book next semester, I have no right to just destroy it. Even though I bought it fair and square, it's mine. I don't have that right. It ought to go to someone who needs it. Right? It's an attitude about our relationship with things that requires a certain care from us. And we don't see this in American culture. We're not taught this way as Americans. As Americans, we're taught ownership is ownership, keep your hands off my stuff. Right? And that becomes a big problem when we start talking about governmental debates about what should we do about the environment. Because if you think ownership is that important, then all of a sudden, the government can't afford to pass this law about the coastline because it's going to cost them so much money to pay off all the landowners who now can't, put up that 5-star hotel. And so in Congress, it becomes very difficult to get any kind of environmental laws through for this reason and for some others. Even though from a Christian perspective, that's the wrong way to think about our relationship with creation. And it isn't just an environmental issue. I guess that's the point I want to make here this morning, and look for your conversation here in the next few minutes about this. We shouldn't think of it just an environmental issue. It's a much broader issue of how we understand our relation with the material world, with how we understand what ownership means for us, with how we understand what obligations we have if we're prosperous. I'm guessing not many of you folks have got a lot of extra money lying around. Students usually don't. But someday you will, like everybody else, hopefully have a good job and have a savings account and wonder what to do with your money. These are really important issues at a personal and spiritual level that connect up with this much larger social, political, environmental level in a way that I think speaks to the integrity of Christian faith. That our faith in God is not just here on Sunday morning, it's not just here and there. It covers so much of our life. Everything we do comes out of that basic understanding. And in my experience, it's a really hard thing for Americans, for us as Americans, to get this Christian vision. Because everything we see on TV, the ads we see, right? You deserve this, you get more and more and more. Everything is pitched to this attitude about our relationship with the material world that is fundamentally not Christian. And it's also difficult for us, of course, because, gosh, it's nice to have that new iPhone, right? Or whatever new gadget, or the latest version of the game, or whatever. These are wonderful things to have, right? But if we have obligations with what we own, then we've got to think twice about that. But anyway, the major focus here is on the creation and environment, those kind of issues. And my appeal would be to say, if we can think differently than Americans typically do about our relationship with material things that we own, we'll have a key for understanding how we need to relate to our creation as a whole and our environmental policy. So, there's an awful lot there. I would really look forward to a conversation here, questions, comments, objections. That's okay. Yes?
You mentioned how it was tough for the government to pass it, but is it necessarily Christian if the government makes you give your land away? Shouldn't it be like the landowner's Christian idea that I shouldn't do this because it's countercultural?
That's a great question. Thank you. What's the role of government? For most of human history, government was them or him, the king or the prince or something like that. But today, government is us, right? We're a democracy. This is called self-government. We are the ones who are making these decisions. Now, it's hard to do that because I'm not a member of Congress, and I'm guessing you're not either. So we have to elect people to do this. But in a democracy, these are people who are speaking for us, ideally. And so they have the authority of the people in making decisions that affect the people. So it's a very different setup today than in earlier undemocratic eras of Christian history. Now, but this does raise this problem that American individualism has turned us against our government. Right? So much of what we say is it's those louts in Congress, those lousy people in the state capitol or wherever. This is not a democratic view of government. Government is self-government, and if we don't like what's going on, we got to somehow change that, and that's not easy to do. But there are certainly ways to get involved. But we have to be careful not to think of government as just those guys who are out to do something terrible to me. That is part of that American individualism. And what we need to say is, we as a people have to decide how these things go. And then when we as a people pass just laws that restrict me, well, I will live by those because of the democratic process. Yes?
What happens when two things that Christian value, such as the environment and then work with the people, are in conflict with one another? So that, let's say there is an environmental issue that will shut down a company, and then those people are out of work.
how, as Christians, how do we approach that issue or that problem and balance that out?
That's a great question, how to do this. The first thing we should notice, of course, is these kinds of trade-offs are not just happening out in the public environmental world. We see them in our own life, right? You got an assignment due in school tomorrow, and your best friend wants you to come and help him out tonight, right? What do, right? This is a trade-off, right? We've had these things, or two different groups of friends want something from you this evening. So the kinds of trade-offs that we face are ubiquitous. That we always face those, and they're difficult. And so we have to ask, is there somehow some principle involved in one that's more important than the principle involved in the other? Sometimes that's the truth, and so we stand with the more important. But oftentimes, these are competing values, and we have to discern that. And I don't think we can say either that every conceivable job is more important than the environment, or vice versa. It will take some prudence, we call that in the Christian tradition, to discern the various values. And oftentimes there's maybe be a compromise available that one might look for. But there's no question that we face a complicated moral life, and that those kind of trade-offs are there. And that's part of what makes life difficult, but also what makes life rich. Others, comments, questions? So what's back here? Yes? No? Please.
It's more of a, I'm curious to see your take on it. In northern Wisconsin, mining is kind of a huge issue right now, especially in terms of mining around reservations. And it's the exact same concept you're talking about. You get these jobs from, which are almost undoubtedly temporary. But then you get extreme pollution from the rivers and waters. But the interesting part, though, is many of the jobs that are being, quote unquote, created by these things are not from that area. And that individuals kind of move up for the mining towns for a bit and then move away. And I'm just curious to see, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
But this is another example of these kind of trade-off questions, right? And the same thing is true in northern Minnesota and elsewhere. Mining is a very conflictual issue because of exactly what you said. And most of the local communities, many of them are in favor of this because of the jobs it will bring. But of course, some citizens are also quite opposed because of the long-term, sometimes hundreds of year environmental problems that you'll be living with afterwards. And I don't think there's any general solution. One, again, has to look at these things. But often what does happen is a loss of the long-term perspective because of that short-term desire for jobs. And we're called to a long-term perspective in life, that's for sure. Not to ignore temporary problems, but to make sure that we don't just look selfishly at ourselves for the next 10 years, but rather ask those much longer-term questions. Yes?
Not too long ago, they found some copper that up in northern Minnesota that when it touches the air, it turns into sulfuric acid. Do you think that is damaging the environment?
You know, you need a chemist here, and you know what I think about chemistry, so I'm totally incompetent to deal with this question. We have to assess, what is the damage from that. I don't know. Sulfuric acid sounds pretty bad to me, but again, they want to talk to a chemist. I'm sorry, I wouldn't know how to estimate that.
When you refer to mining, are you referring to the oil drilling or frac sand mining?
Well, we were talking about other kinds of minerals, but clearly southeastern Minnesota has a big debate about the frac sand mining. And of course, the current natural gas boom entails the issue of fracking and what kind of damage does that do to the land. Could it be done more responsibly? Some people claim with more care, an extra set of pipes around the whole thing, you could do it much more responsibly. Lots of debates about that. And the other piece of the current natural gas boom is that it's also reduced greatly our use of coal in generating energy, which means there's a lot less carbon being put in the air because of natural gas. These are very complicated issues and trade-offs in several different directions. Yes.
You know how right now we're in like in this like
Louder,
mild,
please.
sorry. You know how right now we're in that mild recession? We're still recovering from it, right?
I haven't-
I said, you know how we're still in that mild recession, the United States? And
What discussions?
the mild recession.
Mild recession.
That we're in right now. And and you're talking about how we can use resources and everything for just keep the environment cleaner and everything. How do you think we could combine getting the economy back up and using also keeping the environment clean and everything? How could we combine those ideas in order to keep the economy stable, but also keeping keeping the environment clean? You know?
So the trade-off between sort of economic prosperity and the environment. Clearly, one of the big areas is energy. We were mentioning this as came up a little bit ago. The long term has to be a move toward renewable energies, various kinds of renewable energy. But that's going to take a while to do. So one has to look for sort of a transition to that. And there's a lot of complicated issues about that and what we can do as a nation to make that happen more quickly. But that's going to be important. I think you heard on was it Monday about the carbon problem and all the rest of it. Very serious issues. The other has to do with economic growth itself. And do we need to be more prosperous? And probably for us, we don't. There's going to be another iPhone and one after that and one after that. And how much that's actually improving our welfare is a good question, right? But there are many people in the world who don't get 3 square meals a day, right? Whose kids are growing up hungry, right? Who don't have schools. I've been to places where secondary school happens with the teacher and the student, but there are no books, no papers, no pencil, no chalk in the room, because the money has all been siphoned away in corruption. There are people living their lives this way. And so for them, somehow turning this around and making education and healthcare and these things possible will require economic growth in those countries. So once again, it's a difficult trade-off we have to see here, and be prepared for ourselves to pay a price. We won't have everything quite the way we would like it. I'm worried about the time, but just check in.
Can I ask you one last question? I
How
suspect.
can I turn it down?
Yeah. I suspect that not many of us in this room have ever heard about the relationship between ownership and Christianity, right, and discipleship. Why do you think that is?
Ooh.
Why don't we talk about the morality of
Yeah.
ownership?
I think for one, this literature is not well known. Even among scholars, it's not well known. For another, our pastors don't preach about these things. It's clearly part of Christian doctrine, Catholic doctrine. Look at the popes, they're talking this very directly. But it's controversial, because we have political parties that differ on this issue, just as we have political parties that differ on abortion and lots of other issues. And yet we don't have sort of the political courage to stand up for these kind of issues. So, but I don't want to say it's just our pastors either, because many individual Christians don't want to bring these topics up because they're divisive, right? They're going to find their friends don't agree with them. And so we let that stuff go and talk about the weather and sports and things. But that's a great question. I don't know the answer. But I'm realizing it's 9:30 and others have much to tell us here today.
Thank you so much.